So thank you very much for having me. Is it all right if I walk around? Is that okay?
Yeah.
So thank you to Jenny and Dr. Cahill and Dr. Zach for letting me be a part of the Climate Science Center. This is really an exciting opportunity for me within my own work and to be more involved in the tech community. So thank you for letting me be here today. So I'm here to talk about the article that I just wrote called "The Tragedy of the Vital Commons." Is this going to work? We'll just do this. So this paper is about common pool resources, and I'm going to focus on one specific type of common pool resource that we in West Texas know very well, and that's groundwater. Common pool resources, some examples of this, right, are a dormitory common room. First day of the semester, it's pristine. Last day of the semester, it looks something like that. But we also have examples of common pool resources that don't end up being ruined and destroyed, right? Like the famous, infamous reality TV show Deadliest Catch that follows crab fishing vessels in the Alaskan Sea, in the Bering Sea, where they compete for crab catch, and they end up doing it without diminishing the resource and also resulting in relatively little bloodshed between the captains. So let's talk about groundwater as a type of common pool resource and some facts about groundwater. 97% of all fresh water on the planet comes from groundwater. And freshwater demands outpace supply by 15 to 20%. This was a statistic that was derived in 2001 from the UN conference celebrating World Water Day. So we already have a global sort of shortage in groundwater demands. So let's talk about our very own Ogallala Aquifer. It stretches over 8 states and it spans more than 174,000 miles. It is a huge, massive aquifer. And it is absolutely vital to the communities in West Texas, Western Kansas, and Nebraska. So Texas and the Ogallala Aquifer, only about 12% of the aquifer actually underlies Texas, but more than a quarter of the irrigated lands in the U.S. overlie the aquifer. So that means that there is a lot of agriculture going on here in West Texas, which is sort of like saying that the sun is round, right? So 60% of fresh water used in Texas comes from groundwater. This is a very, very high percentage when we look at comparing nationally. Another state that has an extremely high percentage of reliance on groundwater is California. And finally, of that 60%, 80% is used for irrigation purposes. So we have a very heavy reliance on groundwater generally and a heavy reliance on groundwater for irrigation purposes. So most people have heard of the tragedy of the commons, so I just want to run through that relatively briefly. The ideas that Garrett Hardin talked about in the mid-1960s is that when you have an open pasture, right, and you've got cattle that are grazing on it, you have individuals that are interested in internalizing those benefits from having a cow there, right? And so when they have a cow, they sell the cow and they get money for their cow. They don't share that with anybody else, right? But of course, the cows eat grass. Now, since this is an open pasture and nobody has any private property rights on the pasture, the costs of the cows eating all of the grass, right, are externalized and distributed among all of the users in the open pasture, right? So they are not internalizing the costs while they're internalizing the benefits of using the common pool resource. And so Garrett Hardin says eventually when we have an open pasture like this that is finite, right? It has a limitation to its capacity, and we're externalizing all these costs, we have ruin and destruction. So Hardin has this great line in Tragedy of the Commons where he says, ruin is the end to which all men rush when we use a common pool resource unchecked without any sort of private property rights. So that's the basic framework for a common pool resource. So what are the possible solutions to avoid us running towards ruin and destruction? Well, one is we create private property rights, right? So I'm a property law professor. I teach first-year property law students. And I teach water law, which is really just sort of an advanced property law class. And we look at why we identify property rights in person A versus person B, or not at all, right? So private property rights are one way of potentially solving this problem of the tragedy of the commons. Another, which is sort of in vogue now, are institutional informal norms. Now, the scholar that really popularized this idea was Dr. Eleanor Ostrom from Indiana University, that worked on these informal institutions that work in a close-knit community and operate to regulate conduct such that overuse does not exist. So there's one final one, right? And that's government regulation. That is the other option of trying to solve this tragedy of the commons. So let's talk about informal norms for a minute. I don't want to spend a lot of time on this because this is really more about private property. But the way this works, right, is we have existing communities, right, that we are connected to, that we are bound by, that we exist in. And when people in our community deviate from the norms in the community, we shame them, right? So I live in southern Lubbock, right? And when somebody doesn't mow their lawn, right, we say, oh, the Johnsons, have you seen their lawn, right? That's a shaming thing. That creates reputational harm. And so when the Johnsons find out about this, they say, oh my gosh, I better go mow my yard, right? So I thought this was sort of a lovely picture of the dog shaming meme that says 0 days since the last toilet paper massacre, and it has this terribly sad puppy on it. So this is the idea, right? We're not using formal legal mechanisms. There are no police officers that are going around saying, hey, you better mow your lawn, right? This is happening informally, right, by any member of the community that can enforce these reputational sanctions that end up encouraging the corrections from the deviant conduct, right? So another sort of example of this would be eBay, right? When you bid on an item in eBay, you can look at the seller's feedback and say, well, they shipped the item slow, or the item wasn't described correctly. All of these things end up affecting conduct, right? So in order for the seller to rehabilitate their reputation, they can conform their conduct by shipping quickly, et cetera, et cetera. So same thing with Twitter. There are all sorts of social media communities that exist where reputational sanctions can end up conforming conduct. So informal norms is one option to curtail conduct. But private property is the main one, right? So when we say we're going to create private property in an area, right, this is a formal creation of the right to exclude. The ability to tell someone you cannot come on my property is fundamental to the idea of it being property, right? That is what makes it property, is that you can do with it what you want, and you can tell people that they can't use it or that they have to leave. The other thing that private property does is it incentivizes the internalization of costs, right? So you're not going to have 15 cows on your land, right? Because your land is going to be rendered barren in the near or immediate future, right? So you're more likely to use your resource, your private property, in a more responsible manner, right? So that it doesn't end up being a barren wasteland. Obviously, this also encourages good stewardship of the land, and it entails thinking about the future, also known as sustainability. Now, sustainability was not a word that Hardin used, but the idea is that people that own private property, they want to pass it down to their children, and so they want to make sure that it still exists, right? So these are all the sort of purported benefits of private property and why it is a possible solution to overuse of common pool resources. So let's talk about Texas groundwater. The law of, why is there a picture of a fox up there? Here's why. So the law of groundwater rights in Texas is strange, okay? It comes from a mid-1800s case called Pearson versus Post. And in Pearson versus Post, the question was, when two people are hunting a fox, one person catches it first, right? But the other guy was hunting it for 3 days, and he spent all this time and labor hunting it. Well, who has the property right? Do we invest the labor and investment in chasing the fox, or do we reward the actual capture and possession of the fox, right? So in this case, the court said, well, we reward actual possession. So when they've captured the fox, right, that's where we say you have a property right. It doesn't matter whether somebody's been chasing it for a week. What we want to do here is encourage foxes to be hunted, because in the 1800s they were a nuisance, right? They were a scourge. They killed chickens, they ruined crops, et cetera, et cetera. So this is from a 19th century case that says we need to encourage the behavior of capturing the fox quickly, right? And this is the best way to do it, by reducing it to possession. So this created the rule called the rule of capture. So we have interpreted this in Texas in a 1904 case called, we all refer to as the East case, where if you have two people that are pumping water, right? If you capture the water, it's yours. Doesn't matter whether the water in the aquifer was technically underneath someone else's land. If you pump it, it's yours. So we've applied the rule of capture that was created in this case about foxes to groundwater. And part of the reason we do that, the court says, is groundwater is a cult. We don't understand how it works, right? Just like you can't predict and map how a fox is going to move and how it's going to operate, right? And so in 1904, we didn't know a lot about groundwater aquifers and how groundwater moved, what geologic formations existed underground. And so they said, look, rule of capture applies to groundwater. As soon as you pump it, it's reduced to your possession and you own it. And then in 1999, we have Cipriano versus Ozarka. The gentleman, Mr. Cipriano, owned a piece of land in Texas. Ozarka Water Company comes by, they buy a piece of land next to him, and they pump something like 50,000 gallons of water a day. Mr. Cipriano's well dried up like that. And so he sues in court to say, these people are taking my water. That's not fair, right? I'm a property owner, you can't take my water. And the court said, you're wrong, because they pumped it, and so they own it, right? See Pearson versus Post, 1830, whatever. So there is no limitation on the right of capture, right? And today we have a sad puppy dog because the method of regulating groundwater use in Texas is by way of groundwater conservation districts. These are political subdivisions. They are not arms of the state, and they're like a regulatory agency, but they don't have the authority to tell a farmer or an entity, you're pumping too much water. They can't do that because that is a restriction on a private property right that is inconsistent with the idea of owning property. So Texas, we have a problem. Here's the problem. The problem is the Ogallala Aquifer is severely depleted. Dr. Hale, you just wrote about this in Texas CEO magazine. We have significant levels of depletion all across the state, primarily in the high plains here. The first problem is this cone of depression. This is what I referenced earlier, with one well sinking lower than another and ending up drying up the shallow well, thereby rendering their property waterless, right? That's one problem that occurs here. Another problem that is applicable here is climate change, right? So the picture on the left is if we take drastic measures to start reducing our carbon emissions. Picture on the right is if we continue on the pace that we're on. And that is looking at soil moisture, right? And we have an increased likelihood of drought. And so with all of those things, that just means that the Ogallala Aquifer is going to recharge even slower and that there's going to be less water to go around, generally speaking. So the vital commons, why do we need this term? The idea is that when we think about common pool resources, the overuse of a certain common pool resource may be worse in some circumstances and not as bad as others, right? So if a pasture goes barren, maybe that's not a big deal. But if the Ogallala Aquifer, which is relied upon by hundreds of thousands of people, goes barren, we have a serious problem. So I created this term to differentiate between types, the variability of harm for overuse of certain common pool resources. And it's identified to try and demonstrate how problematic this facet is. So I'll just talk about the traits of the vital commons, right? So how do we define a vital commons from your sort of ordinary run-of-the-mill? One of the ways is that it has to be relied upon by a massive population, right? And that's certainly the case here. The other idea is that it is absolutely necessary for sustenance, right? We could all live without crab, right? We could all live without crab that the Alaskan fishermen catch. And that finally, the most important one, I think, is the damage and depletion of the common pool resource is non-remediable. the Ogallala Aquifer recharges very slowly, and so it's unlikely that we would be able to remedy that in any meaningful way. So the idea of this term is that by creating a model and saying these things are types of vital commons, certain responses to that, private property, state ownership of the resource, or informal norms, gives us a better sense of which one of those solutions is going to work better in some of the for that respective common pool resource. And oh wait, one more slide. Sorry. So here's why, in my view, the privatization of groundwater is really problematic. It's obviously incapable of sustaining the resource. People aren't good stewards of the resource because we have overpumping. There's been overpumping for decades, and people are not thinking about it in the way that Hardin thought that they would, right, in terms of sustaining the resource. The fact that there isn't a limitation on your neighbor's ability to capture groundwater simply means that we're creating a race to the pump, right? If you pump it, then you own it. But if you don't pump it and say, hey, we should be sustainable, that just means your neighbor's going to pump it first, right? And so that's the real problem of privatization in terms of groundwater, is that it's not doing the things that we expect it to do under the Hardin model. So that's my talk. I'm sorry I went over. I apologize.
Good time for one question.
So how would you start to change the dynamic?
I think it's a super complicated problem. One of those things is it's about education and conveying to people the real dangers of how much water they're using and what the context is for its demands on the resource. But I think the real problem with this is something that Carol Rose from Arizona and Yale talked about, is that we develop these reliance interests on property based on stories we tell ourselves about that type of property's importance in our own lives, and we become so used to it that the idea of a future without it or with less of it is simply incomprehensible. And so that dovetails with the stuff we were talking about today. But I think it's really about changing culture and changing norms and expectations.